The Council on Foreign Relations. In the spring of 1918, a group of people met at the Metropolitan Club in New York City to form the Council on Foreign Relations. The group was made up of high-ranking officers of banking, manufacturing, trading, and finance companies, together with many lawyers, concerned primarily with the effect that the war and the Treaty of Peace might have on post-war business. The honorary chairman was Elihu, a Wall Street lawyer, former New York senator, former Secretary of War under McKinley, former Secretary of State under Theodore Roosevelt, member of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1912, and the most recognized Republican of his time. From June 1918 to April 1919, they held a series of dinner meetings on a variety of international matters, but soon disbanded. In the fall of 1917, a group called the Inquiry was assembled by Colonel Edward M. House to negotiate solutions for the Paris Peace Conference in Versailles. They worked out of the American Geographical Society doing historical research and writing position papers. The Inquiry was formed around the inner circle of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, which was a group of American socialist-oriented intellectuals. House, President Wilson's most trusted advisor, who was an admirer of Marx, in 1912, anonymously wrote the book Philip Drew, Administrator, published by Fabian B. W. Hoopsch, which was a novel that detailed the plans for the takeover of America, by establishing socialism as dreamed by Karl Marx, and the creation of a one-world totalitarian government. This was to be done by electing an American president through deception regarding his real opinions and intentions. The book also discussed the graduated income tax, and tax-free foundations. The novel became fact, and Philip Drew was actually House himself. On May 30, 1919, Baron Edmond de Rothschild of France hosted a meeting at the Majestic Hotel in Paris, between the Inquiry, which was dominated by J.P. Morgan's people, and included members such as historian George Louis Beers, who later became the U.S. representative for the Round Table, Walter Lippmann, Frank Adelot, Whitney H. Shepardson, Thomas W. Lamont, Jerome D. Green, Colonel Edward House, Dr. James T. Shotwell, Professor Archibald Coolidge, General Tasker H. Bliss, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, Irwin D. Canham, of the Christian Science Monitor, and Herbert Hoover, who, when he was elected to the presidency in 1928, chose CFR member Henry L. Stimson to be his Secretary of State, and the Round Table, including members Lord Alfred Milner, Lord Robert Cecil, Lord Eustace Percy, Lionel Curtis, and Harold Temperley, to discuss a merger. They met again on June 5, 1919, and decided to have separate organizations, each cooperating with the other. On July 17, 1919, House formed the Institute of International Affairs in New York City, and the Inquiry became the American branch of the Round Table. Their secret aims were to coordinate the international activities and outlooks of all the English-speaking world into one, to work to maintain peace, to help backward, colonial, and underdeveloped areas to advance towards stability, law and order, and prosperity, along the lines somehow similar to those taught at Oxford and the University of London. The Council on Foreign Relations, and the Institute of International Affairs, both supporters of Wilson, strongly supported the League of Nations. However, the Round Table wanted to weaken the League by eliminating the possibility of collective security in order to strengthen Germany, and isolate England from Europe so an Atlantic power could be established, consisting of England, the British Dominions, and the United States. In 1921, when it became apparent that the United States wasn't going to join the League, the Council on Foreign Relations was incorporated on July 21, consisting of members from both groups, and others who had participated in the 1919 Paris peace talks. The name change was made so that the American branch of the Round Table would appear to be a separate entity, and not connected to the organization in England. The Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, became the American headquarters for the Illuminati. Led by House, who wrote the charter, they were financed by Paul Warburg, Jacob Schiff, William Averell Harriman, Frank Vanderlip, Bernard Baruch, Nelson Aldrich, J. P. Morgan, Otto Kahn, Albert H. Wiggin, Herbert H. Lehman, and John Rockefeller. The membership of the CFR was mainly made up from the 150 members of House's task force which worked on the peace treaty. Many were associates of the J.P. Morgan Bank. The first board consisted of the 7 who were on the merger committee: Whitney H. Shepardson, Executive Secretary; George W. Wickersham, Chairman; Wall Street lawyer, Attorney General for President Taft; Frank L. Polk, Wall Street banker; Under Secretary of State, Paul Warburg; William R. Shepard, President of Columbia University; Edwin F. Gay, Secretary-Treasurer, who later became the editor of the New York Evening Post, which was owned by CFR member Thomas Lamont, who was a senior partner of J.P. Morgan and a financial advisor to President Wilson; and Stephen P. Duggan, Director of the International Education Board, plus 9 others. John W. Davis, President, former Ambassador to Great Britain, former Democratic Congressman from West Virginia, who later became chief counsel for J.P. Morgan and Company, Rockefeller Foundation trustee, and also a Democratic candidate for the presidency in 1924, Elihu Root, honorary president, Paul D. Cravath, vice president New York lawyer, Archibald Carey Coolidge, Harvard historian, Isaiah Bowman, director of the American Geographical Society, Norman H. Davis, N.Y. banker, former Under-Secretary of State, John H. Finley, associate editor at the New York Times, David F. Houston, former Secretary of Treasury, and Otto Kahn, N.Y. banker. Other members included J. P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Edward M. House, Christian Herter, Jacob Schiff, Avril Harriman, Nelson Aldrich, Bernard Baruch, Owen D. Young, Russell C. Leffingwell, John Dulles, Alan Dulles, James T. Shotwell, Professor Charles Seymour, Joseph Chamberlain, Philip Jessup, Philip Mosley, Grayson Kirk, Henry M. Riston, Arthur H. Dean, Philip D. Reed, John J. McCloy, and Walter Lippmann, founder of the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, where All Souls College at Oxford University was the base for round-table operations in England. The Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton University, established by Abraham Flexner of the Carnegie Foundation and Rockefeller's General Education Board, was the center of activities for the American branch. Their membership grew from 97 in 1921 to 210 in 1922. In 1927, they began to receive funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, and later the Carnegie Endowment and Ford Foundation, in addition to the financial support they got from J.P. Morgan and the Wall Street banking interests. By 1936, their membership reached 250, and they already had a lot of influence on 5 American newspapers: the New York Times, New York Herald Tribune, Christian Science Monitor, the Washington Post, and the Boston Evening Transcript. This gave them the ability to slant the news in a way which would reflect their views, and thus begin the process of molding America to suit their needs. In 1937, the CFR came up with the idea for committees on foreign relations, which would be established in various major cities around the country, for the serious discussion of international affairs by leading citizens in widely separated communities. Between 1938 and 1940, Francis P. Miller organized these mini-councils with funding from the Carnegie Corporation, to better influence thinking across the country. John W. Davis said after World War II that these committees had provided an avenue for extending the council to every part of the country. These CFR subsidiaries were established in 38 cities: Albuquerque, Atlanta, Billings, Birmingham, Boise, Boston, Casper, Charlottesville, Chicago, the most prominent, Cleveland, Denver, Des Moines, Detroit, Houston, Indianapolis, Little Rock, Los Angeles, Louisville, Miami, Nashville, Omaha, Philadelphia, Phoenix, Portland, Portland, Orr, Providence, Rochester, St. Louis, St. Paul, Minneapolis, Salt Lake City, San Francisco, Santa Barbara, Seattle, Tampa Bay, Tucson, Tulsa, Wichita, and Worcester. The CFR has always claimed to be a private organization that doesn't formulate any government policy. In fact, the following disclaimer appears on their books: the Council on Foreign Relations is a non-profit institution devoted to the study of the international aspects of American political, economic, and strategic problems. It takes no stand, expressed or implied, on American policy. From the beginning, their goal was to infiltrate the government, and that was done. Actually, they were so successful that today, the CFR practically controls and dictates both domestic and foreign policy. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had Henry Wallace, Secretary of Agriculture, and Louis Douglas, Director of the Budget Bureau, work with a CFR study group on national self-sufficiency, out of which came the Export-Import Bank and the Trade Agreements Act of 1934. On September 12, 1939, after the start of World War II, CFR members Hamilton Fish Armstrong, editor of the CFR magazine Foreign Affairs, and Walter H. Mallory, executive director, went to the State Department and met with Assistant Secretary of State George S. Messersmith, CFR member, to offer the services of the Council by establishing a CFR study group concerning the war and a plan for peace, which would make recommendations to the State Department. They proposed to do research, and make informal recommendations in areas regarding national security and economics. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, and Under Secretary of State Sumner Welles, CFR member, liked the idea, and the War and Peace Studies Project was initiated with funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, who gave grants totaling $300,000 over a 6-year period. Under that umbrella, there were 5 study groups, each with 10 to 15 men and a full-time paid secretary. Altogether, between 1940 and 1945, there were 100 people involved, with 362 meetings, producing 682 documents, and meets regularly with State Department officials. War and Peace Studies Project. Norman H. Davis, Chairman. Walter H. Mallory, Secretary. Peace Ames, Hamilton Fish Armstrong. Territorial, Isaiah Bowman, President of Johns Hopkins University, Geography expert. Armaments, Allen W. Dulles, International Corporate Lawyer, Hanson W. Baldwin, Military Correspondent for New York Times. Political, Whitney H. Shephardson, Corporate Executive who was House's Secretary at the 1919 Versailles Peace Conference. Economic and Financial, Alvin H. Hansen, Professor of Political Economy at Harvard, Jacob Viner, Professor of Economics at University of Chicago. In December 1941, at the urging of the CFR, the State Department created the 14-member Advisory Committee on Post-War Foreign Policy, in which the CFR was represented by 8 of its members. 2 more became members later. The core of the group was Cordell Hull, Sumner Wells, Norman H. Davis, Myron C. Taylor, Corporate Executive, Isaiah Bowman and Leo Pozvolsky, Economist, all of whom were CFR members, with the exception of Hull, and were known as the Informal Political Agenda Group, which Roosevelt called his post-war advisors. They controlled the committee, and were assisted by a research staff financed and controlled by the CFR. In order to formulate a closer liaison between the CFR and the Advisory Committee, the research secretaries from the War and Peace Studies were brought into the State Department as consultants to the corresponding subcommittee of the Advisory Committee. The committee had their last general meeting in May 1942, and all work from then on occurred at the subcommittee level. As World War II came to an end, CFR study groups planned the reconstruction of Germany and Japan, the establishment of the United Nations, the initiation of the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, the UN International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. In December 1943, the CFR began to outline their proposal for the United Nations, which was presented at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference. Historian Ruth B. Russell wrote in her 1958 book, A History of the United Nations Charter, The Role of the United States, 1940 to 1945, that the substance of the provisions finally written into the UN Charter in many cases reflected conclusions reached at much earlier stages by the United States government. In 1945, the CFR moved into their present headquarters, which was largely financed by Rockefeller, and the study groups disbanded, with the men in those groups taking their place in the forefront of national affairs. For instance, Allen Dulles, former president of the CFR, was appointed director of the CIA, and John Foster Dulles became Eisenhower's Secretary of State. Senator Barry Goldwater would later say, "From that day forward the Council on Foreign Relations had placed its members in policymaking positions with the federal government, not limited to the State Department." In 1945, Senator Arthur K. Vandenberg, a leading Republican, and a CFR member, traveled around the country to drum up support for the creation of the United Nations. He was also instrumental in getting the Republican-controlled Congress to go along with Truman's CFR-controlled foreign policy. When the UN conference met in San Francisco in 1945, there were 47 CFR members in the U.S. delegation, including Alger Hiss, a State Department official and communist spy, who in 1950 was convicted of perjury after denying he had passed secret documents to the Russians, and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Harry Dexter White, a communist agent, Owen Lattimore, who was called by the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, a conscious articulate instrument of the Soviet conspiracy, Nelson Rockefeller, John Foster Dulles, Dean Acheson, Harold Stassen, Ralph Bunche, John J. McCloy, Adlai Stevenson, Philip Jessup, John Carter Vincent, identified as a security risk, Edward R. Stettinius, Secretary of State, Leo Pozvolsky, Joseph E. Johnson, Clark M. Eichelberger, and Thomas K. Finletter. In 1925, Lionel Curtis established the Institute of Pacific Relations, IPR, in 12 countries, in order to steer America towards communism. The Round Table Finger organization was financed by the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and the Ford Foundation. The American branch received funding from Standard Oil, Vacuum Oil, Shell Oil, International General Electric, Bank of America, National City Bank, Chase National Bank, International Business Machines, IBM, International Telephone and Telegraph, IT&T, Time Magazine, and J.P. Morgan. The IPR was led by Professor Owen Lattimore, head of Johns Hopkins University School of Diplomacy, who, during a 1951-52 investigation of the IPR, was identified as a Soviet operative. The Senate found the group to be a vehicle toward communist objectives. Men from the IPR, who were all communist or pro-communist, were placed in important teaching positions, and dominated the Asian Affairs section of the State Department. After a 4-year battle, their tax-exempt status was revoked from 1955 to 1960. Their publications were used by the armed forces, colleges, and close to 1,300 public school systems.